Can we rely completely on renewable energy? Greenpeace says it's possible by 2050. But what would the cost be? And what would be the impact on geopolitics? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. 100% renewable energy for all by 2050. That's a message from Greenpeace, which says that not only is it achievable, it's the only way to ensure the world doesn't suffer catastrophic climate change. Renewable energy has become more mainstream and more affordable in many parts of the world. The environmental watchdog says there are no major economic or technical obstacles to full clean energy use by the middle of the century. By switching to renewables, Greenpeace says the world could stabilize global CO2 emissions in 5 years' time, eventually bringing down emissions to close to zero by 2050. The cost would be huge, more than $1 trillion every year to 2050. But Greenpeace says that would be offset by fuel cost savings of just over $1 trillion a year. And the big switch over to green energy could create an estimated 20 million more jobs by 2030. Well, a huge political effort would be needed to come even close to Greenpeace's goal. Environmentalists are calling for renewable energy to be put at the top of the agenda at the Paris Climate Summit in November. And last month, US President Barack Obama voiced his support for the greater use of clean energy.
Federal investments have helped support all this innovation. And now's not the time to pull back on those investments. Now's not the time to insist on massive cuts to the investments in R&D that help drive our economy, including the hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts that many Republicans want to take from these successful job-creating clean energy programs. It's thanks in part to these investments that there are already places across the country where clean power from the sun is finally cheaper than conventional power from your utility. Power often generated by burning coal or gas. And it's impossible to overstate what this means. For decades, we've been told that it doesn't make economic sense to switch to renewable energy. Today, that's no longer true.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Berlin, Jochen Vermuth, founder and chief investment officer of Vermuth Asset Management. In The Hague, Rick Bosman, researcher at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. And in New York, David Elzinga, economic affairs officer for the Sustainable Energy Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Welcome to you all. Well, Greenpeace has broken down its targets. It says 42% renewable energy globally by 2030, 72% by 2040, and 100%, as we said, by 2050. Let's begin with Jochen Vermuth in Berlin. Are these figures realistic, do you believe?
Well, as you may recall, forecasts are always difficult to make. Few people would have thought at the turn of the century that a road in New York or Berlin full of horses would be turned into a road full of cars just 10 years later, and that a Dow Jones index full of steam engine railway companies will be turned into an index without any steam engines. And similarly, we may have seen the end of the fossil fuel age here in Germany with the decline of our big power plants traditionally already done, and with the market forces now driving renewables forward, I believe even without an agreement in Paris, even though it would be highly desirable to have a price on carbon, free market forces will now drive renewables forward very powerfully. We have 4 cents per kilowatt hour in Austin, Texas now, and that means oil would have to fall to $7 a barrel to compete. There's now going to be a breakthrough with free market forces having broken the dam, and renewables can take over the world. The question is, who will be part of this revolution? Will it be led from Germany and other places of the world? Will the new laggards be America? We think it's doable, achievable, and that free market forces will show us the way there.
Well, Rick Bosman, there we've got the argument that free market forces are going to drive this whole process. Your view?
Yeah, I think the important thing to note is that while these ambitions of Greenpeace seem wildly ambitious, actually Greenpeace is and the German Aerospace Center, who has led the scenario planning, they have been the institutes that have been spot on with predicting the development of renewable energy, where more renowned institutes such as the International Energy Agency make their estimates turn out wildly conservative, actually, and Greenpeace has been spot on if you compare the actual development of renewables to their estimates. So although their estimates seem wildly ambitious, I believe they have been the institutes that have been spot on so far. So maybe they might turn out true.
Well, David Elzinga, just to be absolutely specific here, what Greenpeace is saying is a total movement away from coal, from oil, from nuclear plants by the middle of this century. Your view, do you think it is feasible, these goals?
Thank you. I'm encouraged by the report, and I think there's many positive things. But I think in some ways it goes too far, and in some ways it doesn't go far enough. When I look at the power sector, for certain, we've seen tremendous growth. But one thing that the report lacks is a real investigation into the industrial sector, for instance, steel and cement production. And in those cases, it's much more difficult to replace the energy needs with renewable sources. So on the other side, when I look at their views on transport, they're talking very much about electric vehicles and things like that. At the UNECE, we're really focusing on systems thinking. So instead of talking about cars and the transition to electric vehicles, we want to talk about mobility services. So let's just talk about the actual service the energy can provide, as opposed to the mode at which it's going to be, because a bike can be more cost-effective, more quick than, say, a car.
Well, Rick Bosman, an important point there about the lack of focus on the steel industry, the cement industry. These are aspects that are going to be major problems in terms of the years ahead if Greenpeace is to achieve these type of goals. How great a stumbling block is specific industries such as steel, such as cement?
Yeah, if I speak from my Dutch experience, we have a very large chemical industry here. And of course, this is a very energy-intensive industry as well. And what we see with players, for example, such as AkzoNobel, they're actually investigating and investing in renewable energy sources. And one of the main drivers for them is to actually hedge against the fluctuations in fossil fuel energy sources. So I see opportunities also for such players where as soon as you invest in a wind turbine, you know roughly how much that wind turbine is going to produce over its lifetime. So you kind of hedge against fluctuations in your energy costs.
Well, Jochen Vermuth, you mentioned Germany as possibly a template for a global process. I mean, taking a look at Germany, last year, 27.8% of power consumption came from renewable sources. That's compared to 6.2% in 2000. So a massive increase in some 14 years. Is this a template for the rest of the world to look at, to see how the processes have been put in place in Germany, which incidentally is also committed to moving away from nuclear power by 2022?
Well, I think that many people have challenged the feed-in tariff in Germany as being too expensive or too much of a burden on Germans. And in some sense, it has been a burden. But at the end of the day, I think it may have been one of the greatest gifts to humanity. We came from 600 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany to now 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany. We reached 75% renewable power in the summer. Everybody who said it was impossible to manage found out it is possible to manage. But I do think it's a great sample for others to follow, and I do hope we will demonstrate to the world that we're not just an export champion because we happen to be benefiting from a low euro, but because we have a new economic model here focusing on a circular economy without waste, without fossil fuels. But let me take a second, if I may, on the transport and the cement sectors. We happen to be investors in two companies which are highly relevant for both. One company called Primex, based in Riga, Latvia, produces concrete floors, foundations, walls, which are stronger, crack-free, seamless, with 40% less cement. And they're about to roll out globally with IKEA, Lidl, and others as their global clients for the past 5 years. So there are technologies that will make a big difference. But for the system, I think transport really is the key. And what one has to keep in mind, if you're a wind or solar power plant, you have intermittent supply, and you should be putting a battery next to your wind park or your solar park to be able to provide stable supply. But that's difficult and expensive. Happily, as long as people want to drive, they may want to buy electric cars. And electric cars in Germany provide so much battery storage capacity that we have found out in Germany we can move to 100% renewable powered transport without putting in place any more additional power capacity today. That is, we can take 40 million cars off the road in Germany, fossil fuel, replace them with electric battery-driven cars, and that is possible without adding any more power capacity, because these batteries will be charged at night when the wind is blowing and nobody's consuming. They will discharge during the day using so-called bidirectional charging. And our portfolio company, the Mobility House, has pioneered this and found out that on a boring Nissan Leaf, if you like, 100% electric, you could make as much as 2,000 euros a year using your battery in that fashion. If you take a life of battery of 10 years, then you make 20,000 euros off your electric car. Once you've done that, the net price of the battery has gone to zero, and effectively all you've got left is some windshield wipers and some brake pads to change, and otherwise it's a very, very simple vehicle. It'll be very cheap, and it's about to replace the fossil fuel cars very quickly. And as a result, Germany stands to be a leader there as well. We've just introduced, finally, I hope, by law, taxi lanes, bus lanes for electric cars, free charging and parking downtown, and financial incentives are being promised by Mrs. Merkel now, such that hopefully we catch up to Holland and Norway in terms of introduction of electric cars. With Germany now 20 electric vehicles on the market, Volkswagen announcing 20 new electric vehicles, and maybe being additionally incentivized by being a bit creative with the rules.
Well, I'm going to return to the issue of subsidies in a moment, but Rick Bosman, I want to stay with the example of Germany. On July the 25th, it reached a record. 78% of the day's electricity demand was met with renewable resources. Now, this was a particular weather pattern, strong storms in the north where the wind turbines are, mixed with sunny weather in the south where the solar panels are. Now, this is a great achievement, but at the same time it shows the fickle nature of reliance on natural sources for energy, does it not?
Indeed it does, and I think also looking at the example of Germany, I lived in Germany and studied the German case for about 3 years myself. And what is not very much understood is that it's very much a locally driven process. If you add up all the ambitions of the different states in Germany, you come actually at a higher ambition level at the federal level than the national target. So it's very much driven by the regions and driven by the people locally. So also the feed-in tariff actually enabled everyone that wanted to invest in renewable energies to do so. So if you look at the numbers of the new installed renewable capacity, only 6.5% is invested in by the large four energy suppliers, so MBW, Vattenfall, E.ON, and RWE, and over 50% is invested in by individual citizens, energy cooperatives, of which there are already over 800 in Germany now, and farmers. So that means a fundamental change in ownership in your energy system, and therefore a fundamental change in the organization of your energy system. So if you look at the example of Germany, I encourage to look into that aspect very much as well. So how can you enable people at the local level to get involved in your energy transition, because this is where eventually it needs to happen.
Well, David Elzinga, that is actually a very important detail there. In Germany, 50% of new renewable energy capacity are decentralized energy systems owned by private people, as we heard, by farmers, by energy corporations. In a way, this is a process happening from the bottom up rather than the top down, not reliant on governments to lead the way, but allowing people to lead the way. How important is this issue in the whole process?
Well, I think your statement is not quite true. A couple points. Germany, we can demonstrate many good examples or many good aspects from the German example, but there's also many negative aspects. For one, they're still one of the largest coal users in Europe. Now it's in decline, as the other speaker had said. So, but let's remember that the economy has been built and the infrastructure has been built using fossil fuels. So that's one point. Secondly, the growth in renewables has been driven initially by government support. So it's not quite fair to say it's been driven from the bottom up. So I think it's we can take many good examples from that, but you still have other problems like stranded assets from the utilities, and this is a problem that is being faced by many utilities around the world. But I also want to bring this to another point, is that you're talking about Germany, which is a developed country, a very rich country, and I'm glad to see leadership coming from that point of view. But what do you say to a country like India, who instead of having a Mercedes, electric vehicle Mercedes to hook up to their solar system, they transport their family of 5 people on a scooter or a moped? And how do you ask them to put on a solar panel and buy a Mercedes so that it can have reliable power? And also, what do you say to the countries that have large indigenous resources of coal and fossil fuels? They want to develop and emerge and bring up their standard of living. How can they do that with using fossil fuels sustainably? And I think that's one of the key messages from the UNECE, is that we don't want to ignore fossil fuels. We want to use fossil fuels sustainably. And there are ways to do that. Carbon capture and storage is one example that can then also feed into decarbonizing the other energy sectors. Well, I agree that technology is developing in all these areas, but I think that we have to be very careful to manage the transition rather than just saying, oh, we can do this, we can go 100% renewables, and we push away all the other options.
Well, Rick Bosman, this issue of transition, as mentioned there by David, coal still accounts for 44% of power generation in Germany, for example. So transition here is key, is it not? Moving away from the fossil fuels, moving towards renewable energy sources. But at the same time, as David Elsinger pointing out there, perhaps it is not necessarily an either or, it is an as well as throughout this transition process. Would you agree?
Well, if we take the issue of renewable energy in developing countries, it's actually very interesting. If you look at countries that don't have a grid infrastructure developed yet, often the renewable sources are the most interesting. There is the Solar Home program running in Bangladesh, for example, where they use microloans so that people in rural communities can buy a solar panel with LED lighting, so that that children can do their homework also in the dark. So often, if you look at countries where there is no established grid infrastructure, the renewable is the preferred option. Also, if you look at small island communities, this is often the case, where now they are dependent on importing oil from places far away. And if you have a situation like that, then moving to indigenous renewable energy, solar energy, wind energy is often the cheapest option. So here I don't completely agree with David's statement. I think definitely for such areas, renewables are already the way to go.
Well, Jochen Vermuth, I want to return to the issue that you touched on a little while back, and that is cost. Subsidies. Subsidies around the world are completely slanted and biased towards fossil fuels. Some $500 billion annually are spent on subsidies for fossil fuel sources. That's more than double of what is spent subsidizing renewable energy sources. Is this one of the problems? Is this thinking going to have to change if there is going to be substantial progress?
Well, absolutely. I think that unfortunately our friend David is maybe a bit too stuck in the past with the fossil fuels. I think, of course, the German movement was started with strong government subsidies, but then it's been a bottom-up movement as a result of it. What I'm saying is now we're below grid parity, certainly in emerging markets, and therefore it would be really unhelpful to try to support unproven, expensive technologies as carbon capture and storage, and one should just focus straight out on solar, wind, geothermal. You mentioned at the beginning that you thought it was high cost to spend $1 trillion or so a year on this renewable infrastructure to get to 2050 with 100% renewable. I beg to differ. I think that's almost nothing. That's 2% of global GDP. It's a very small sum. As David mentioned, there's the carbon bubble, the issue of stranded assets, and as a member of the Europeans for Divest Invest, this is a very, very big day for us. We're very proud to announce today that 1 year after convincing the Rockefeller brothers to join the Divest Invest movement, where they committed to divest from fossil fuels within 3 to 5 years, we had set the target that the 50 billion commitments from last year would be increased by factor 3 by today, 1 year later. In fact, we're happy to announce today that we're at $2.5 trillion of commitments of people to divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewables, resource efficiency. It's an amazing movement, an amazing trend that's happening. It's happening for two reasons. One is a moral reason. The climate change issue is the human rights issue of our time. To divest from all fossil fuel companies in Dow Jones, you just have to divest 7% of your portfolio. A few years back, to divest from all companies that had something to do with apartheid, that was 80% of the index, and yet this movement stopped apartheid. So the current Divest Invest movement is likely to stop fossil fuels. The second reason is, and that's very important for the point David made with regard to emerging markets, yes, they may have oil, gas and coal reserves, but no, it makes absolutely no sense to spend any penny to develop them. Because, first of all, we know we can only burn about 20% of the remaining oil, gas and coal reserves if we want to survive on this planet, if we want to stick to our 2-degree target. So from a policy point of view, it makes no sense. Secondly, much more importantly, we've seen peak oil. That is not peak oil supply as we all were looking for, but peak oil demand. As the report points out, we've got more growth, less CO2 emissions this year globally. That was something Germany has achieved on its own a few years ago, and now globally we've gotten there. That is, the long-time oil, gas, coal prices will simply be much lower than expected, much lower than currently included in the budgets of all of the annual reports of big oil, gas and coal companies. And we're expecting some $21 trillion of assets having to be written off. So
well, let me go, if I may.
Invest.
Apologies for interrupting, Joachim, but I just want to go to David Elzinga quickly because we are reaching the end of this discussion. Greenpeace suggests that one of the bodies that should lead this process are the Conference of Parties in Paris, the COP21 meeting, the Paris Conference on Climate Change. Is this likely to feature high on the agenda? A policy paper issued by an organization like Greenpeace? Are governments going to take it seriously? Will they look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. Renewables are a tremendous part of the solution, and it will be featured high, and these types of reports from Greenpeace are essential to the overall debate. But I do want to be clear about something, that when I talk about carbon capture and storage, it is a proven technology. It is a technology that has been in part used since the 1970s. So let me be very clear, and in the position of UNECE as well, is that we're highly supportive of renewable technologies. But we need a broad range of technologies, and we need to engage with all of the private sector, that being the fossil fuel community, who right now is simply positioned as part of the problem, so that they can be also part of the solution. And that also goes to the developing and emerging economies that have those indigenous fossil resources. Let's engage with them by simply saying to them, no, you can't develop your country, you can't develop your economy using the resources you have. You must go to renewables. That's going to disengage them from the process, and I don't think that's going to be helpful. We can produce clean energy from fossil fuels. Renewables is one of the very important solutions, but it is not the only solution.
Well, at that particular point, an end to a fascinating and vital discussion. My thanks to our guests, Jochen Vermuth, Rick Bosman, and David Elzinga. And thank you too for watching. Do send us your comments via the program page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.